Before the brightest dawn lies the darkest of night. Against the darkest shadows burn the brightest of lights. It is in the belly of the whale one finds absolution, and in respect for death, a greater appreciation of life. The hardest diamonds form in pressure, and the truest heroes find strength in the dark. Pick up the sword and see out the night, for the truest of good must first conquer the dark. From a young age, many of us were taught the dichotomy between good and evil. There are good people and there are bad people. And while this is all correct, there's a dichotomy in how we are taught these things. Then if you compare it to what we're told the bad people do, the bad people are violent, the bad people lie, the bad people conceal things, the bad people hurt others. Of course, all of this is very true. But what we don't learn about really until later on in life, when we're a bit older, is the idea of the grey area. And it's in that grey area where we find the confrontation of darkness, and where we find true good. Well, what do I mean by all of this? How can you find true good within the grey? What am I talking about? What is this poetic nonsense? Let's take a closer look and find out. Now, to set the scene, and this is what really inspired this video, really, let's take a look at an example of where we're taught this stuff from an early age. Media, specifically Star Wars. And of course we know what the sides are, the Jedi versus the Sith, the light side of the Force versus the dark side of the Force. But then there is just the Force, the magic, doohickey, midichlorian, what have you. Now, many of us who grew up on the prequels and have later grown up and analysed the stories later on can attest that the Jedi within the prequels are not really truly good. And that's kind of the point of the story, that they're full of fallacy, they're too hung up on politics, and as a result, they're also much more detached from the realities of life. And they're really what lead the protagonist, Anakin Skywalker, down the path of darkness, and because they teach detachment from emotion, they never really teach confrontation of those darker parts of his emotions. So as a result, he falls hard into the darkness because he doesn't know what to do. But the thing which trips things up is then there are those circuits of people which then assume that because the Jedi were wrong, then that means the light side of the Force overall is wrong and the Sith is right. No, that's not how that works, I'm afraid. Just because one side is flawed doesn't mean that the other side is automatically great. You're going to ally with the dark side here. I mean, they're called the dark side for a reason. You realise they kill people, torture people, enslave whole planets. They blow up a planet. You're going to ally with them? So they fall into the same trap that Anakin did, of instead of confronting, coming to terms with darker parts of nature, and instead falling headfirst into the darkness and letting it consume them. And where this is relevant to martial arts is that at some point during a person's martial arts journey, they will come to that point of, yes, I am training to harm someone. If, say, someone does boxing or Muay Thai, Judo, what have you, there's that point of where someone realises, I'm trying to hurt someone, and maybe the acknowledgement of that leads on to the realisation that they gain some level of satisfaction from it, some level of enjoyment of it, and then that leads into a whole emotional spiral because they think to themselves, well, most people would think to themselves, but I'm not a bad person, and bad people enjoy hurting people. Am I a bad person? And that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, because any person that is, by nature, a good, decent person does not want to willingly go out to hurt people. Of course it is bad people who are antithetic, that are apathetic, have no sense of empathy, who go out to willingly harm people, and willingly go out to incite violence. Let us actually talk about that confrontation of one's own darkness. Well, let's actually talk about the confrontation of darkness, because there are a few ways that happens. In media, we'll call it the darkest hour, because that's typically when this sort of thing happens in media. It's that lull in the story where the character is feeling hopeless. They're at the lowest point. And what typically takes place at this point of the story is that they have to directly confront some part of themselves that they need to change. There's something that they need to come to terms with. And so as a result, they come out of the darkest hour, strengthened by this confrontation, but in the process they lose something as well. As a typical point in these sorts of stories, that in order to gain something you must also lose something. But what about those times where someone refuses to confront those parts of their nature? We'll call it the nice guy scenario. We'll look at the character of Stefan Salvatore from the Vampire Diaries as an example. Now, as the show's title says, Stefan is a vampire, and from the start of the show, he's depicted as the good vampire, in contrast to his older brother, Damon Salvatore, the bad one. Whereas Stefan, he's this vegetarian, romantic, Byronic, etc. And as we go on, we realise that no, Stefan is just as bad, if not worse, than his brother. He was the one who directly caused his brother to turn in the first place, or at least the one that propelled him into this life of darkness and murder. He's an infamous serial killer with an uncontrollable bloodlust, and that's the reason behind his vegetarian lifestyle. They make a point that ultimately he is a good person, but are you really? He's a nice person. Stefan is nice. That's the better way to phrase him. Because instead of confronting those darker parts of his nature, they phrase a lot of Stefan's problems as being akin to addiction. And instead of just having a light nibble, just having a little bit, just enough to sustain himself, he goes too far and ends up killing people as a result. They phrase a lot of Stefan's problems as being akin to addiction. And instead of just having a light nibble, just having a little bit, just enough to sustain himself, he goes too far and ends up killing people as a result. So, how can you be And come on, mate, you're over 150 years old. You haven't figured out a way around this by now, other than going cold turkey. It's rather a basic thing in the show to learn very quickly, to have a little nibble, and compel or hypnotise people to forget you've done it and move on, without killing people, a very controlled form of sustenance. And you haven't figured that out. What Stefan displays more so is this idea of repression. He represses these darker parts of himself. He prevents himself from doing these darker things. And instead of learning healthier ways to manage the state of what he is, he instead rejects it entirely. And so, as a result, he's not dealing with it in a healthy way. He is instead just using the excuse that he's an addict to explain not getting better. You're not getting better, mate. Whereas by contrast, Damon, the bad brother, he displays very well this idea of integration. He is the one that very quickly adapts to being what he is. Learning very quickly how to be able to just get enough to sustain himself without actually long-term harming someone. And is in fact the one to later on teach the POV character of Elena how to do this properly without it being a problem. And as we learn, Damon throughout his time as a vampire was motivated more so by the far more positive emotion of love than anything else. Whereas Stefan, the good brother, was motivated by addiction and repression. We'll teach in schools all the time to kids that violence is not the answer, that we need to use words or go to a teacher in order to solve our problems when there's a case of bullying or what have you, but as many people learn very quickly, no, that's not the case. And in fact our own history even goes against this very idea. Because how many times has our country or other countries gone to war when there's a worthwhile cause? Just look at the war which probably most defines England's history in the 1900s, World War II. We went up against Nazism. I mean, are you telling me that the fact that we went up against fascism and tyranny and against what we later found out was the awful enslavement and genocide of a group of people, you're telling me we shouldn't have raised an army and gone to fight fascism because violence is wrong? And with this whole idea of integration over repression, I actually have two stories which probably articulate this far more, and are probably stories which a lot more people can relate to than a story about a vampire or what have you. This first one happened when I was probably about 14 or 15, so I was not the most athletic of kids back then. I was not into martial arts as seriously as I am now. I was a bit more of a nerd, still am. Bit doughy, not as much confidence. And there were this group of bullies that would frequently make me their best target. Led by this one chap who, how should I phrase it, looked like the book version of Dudley Dursley. What they would frequently do is, because I had a satchel at the time, they would take the band of this satchel, drop it to around my shins, and pull it out from under me, making me fall to the ground. And this had been going on for several months. Every day, outside on the grass, there I would be just talking with my friends, just having a good time at lunch, and then they would come out of nowhere, pull the satchel out from under me, down I go into the mud. Until finally one day, I just had enough. And when I got back up, I punched one of the cronies in the face. Thankfully, my friends were able to create some distance and restrain everyone before things got too much further out of hand. Because, yeah, but I think it would have been pretty clear that, yeah, a lot worse would have happened after that. I got a week's worth of detention for that. And it goes back to the very idea that we don't really in school teach that violence is the answer. Even though after that, those bullies did leave me alone. Probably helped that for the week afterwards I gave that guy a black eye. But at the time, instead of feeling proud or feeling good about what I did, despite the fact that my friends said I did the right thing, even my mother was happy that I did that and actually got me a dinner out for my troubles. On the inside, I didn't feel as though I had done the right thing, because of course I'd been told, violence is not the answer, you shouldn't do that. Turn the other cheek, tell the teacher. So instead of feeling proud of myself, I felt bad, and I promised to myself I would never do that again. So very much I displayed a form of repression, instead of integrating the idea that violence can sometimes solve your problems, or that sometimes aggression can benefit in a situation. I instead repressed those urges and tried not to do the same thing again. So cut to me being a martial arts teacher, with the second story being one of the first times I felt I was sparring with someone. It's not really a whole big long story, but it was more of an acknowledgement that I was trying to cause some level of pain to someone else, and I was garnering some level of satisfaction from it, some level of enjoyment from it. Of course, this led to the whole spiral that I said about earlier. Am I a bad person? Why do I enjoy violence so much? I shouldn't enjoy violence so much. That's not a good thing to do. But eventually I reached the conclusion that, on some level, to be truly good, you need to be willing to pick up a sword. Of course, I mean this in the metaphorical sense, not in the sense of needing to buy a whole sword collection. What I mean is that in order to be truly good, you need to be willing to have a capacity for violence. Because in order to be truly good, you need to understand evil. This is more of a modern idea within films and television. It's the
"You and I are not so different."
It's fair to say this is a trope and a cliche which has become quite overused, but it's for good reason. Oftentimes, villains are often now portrayed as mirrors of the hero in some fashion or another. The ultimate idea being that these two people were, or did, start out in very similar places, but diverged in very different ways. That both serve as mirrors of each other. A prominent example is Harry Potter. Both characters are orphans who are raised away from their parents, with it being made clear that there are a lot of similarities between the both of them in terms of their characters, that both are willing to go against the rules, that both are willing to stir up trouble, with both of them also being able to amass a number of loyal people around them. But the crucial difference between the two of them is that while Voldemort is a character who rejects the ideas of love, of compassion, of empathy, because he cannot understand them, Harry very much objectively chooses to bask in love. In the love of his family, in the love of his friends. And it's not even really just a thing of that Voldemort was sociopathic from birth, because let's be honest here, Harry was abused from an early age by his aunt and uncle. There was no reason to... There was loads of factors which could have said that Harry could have been raised to be a sociopath as well. But Harry, he chose to be better. He chose to go against the bullies that picked on Neville in his first year. He chose to go into Gryffindor instead of Slytherin. And he chose to make friends with people rather than just have followers. As Dumbledore himself says,
"It is not our abilities that show what we truly are. It is our choices."
But what's interesting is that even though these two are mirrors of each other, and they are kept as these poles of each other, they enhance it on Harry's side. Because before he confronts Voldemort, before he confronts this evil that doesn't know love, that doesn't know empathy or compassion, he understands him first. He goes through the character's history, understands how he grew up, where he came from, what led him down this path. To get a better understanding of what he is facing, of who he is facing behind the mask of Lord Voldemort, he is able to understand the story of Tom Riddle, so then he is better armed to confront that evil. Carl Jung expressed in his work the idea of the shadow. These unseen, unconscious parts of our mind which do not align with the more ideal, altruistic senses of who we are and who we're aiming to be. And he also talked about integrating those parts of oneself. And that if you don't do that, if you repress these darker parts of yourself, if you repress these unseen, unwanted parts of your personality, you will see a sort of possession by you of these darker parts of yourself. Those moments where you go, I don't know what came over me. Flashes of rage. You say something suddenly that you would never normally say. These come as a result of repression. And I myself found myself experiencing one of those sorts of moments when, out of nowhere, I shouted at a teacher when I was 17. And of course, this can become very dangerous very quickly. It's going back to the idea of the nice guy. If you just define yourself as nice, then you're not capable of doing these bad things, these terrible things. If you're not capable of maliciousness, if you're not capable of anger or anything like that, then you have no idea of how to control those urges, those parts of yourself. And so you'll get those, I don't know what came over me moments, and if they become violent, if they become dangerous, then you become at risk of hurting someone. Because you have no way to control yourself. And that is why it is important to integrate those darker parts of our nature. Because if we do not, then in the best case we are placid and easily overwhelmed. We're easy to control or manipulate. And in our worst case, we're someone who is hairline dangerous, who cannot adequately control our darker urges and darker impulses, and therefore becomes a lot more dangerous to ourselves or to others. The capacity for good and evil exists within all of us. The capacity for order and for chaos. But if we are to be someone who is truly good, then we need to be willing to temper our urges for violence. We need to not only be able to wield this metaphorical sword, but we need to be able to temper it with compassion, with love, with kindness. And that is where true good comes from. It's not through the inability to commit these awful things. It's by being willing to acknowledge that we're capable of these things and being able to control that impulse. So that when the moment does rise, when evil does need to be confronted, we can channel those parts of ourselves in the right direction. To bookend all of this, the idea of going back to that just because one side is flawed doesn't mean that the other side is right. The same can be said in a lot of ways of religion. I think that's where some amount of atheism has arisen, especially since the Enlightenment. What you'll often see is that because people disagree with the institution of Christianity, for example, or see the flaws in Christianity, see these people who are high-ranking religious members do these awful, terrible things, they then think that, oh, it's all wrong, and so then they turn towards the side of sin, of doing these terrible things. Maybe not terrible things, that's a bit hyperbolic, but they do these things, they turn away from God. Oh, the same is true in Star Wars. Just because Qui-Gon Jinn, for example, was an example of a true Jedi, because he ignored or went against those parts of the Jedi code which were marred in politics, which were marred in this dogmatic institution, and just follows the pathway of the Force. He truly integrated both light and dark in order to do what is seen as true good. And the same can be true of us. Just because the institution of Christianity, of the Christian institution, can at times be flawed, it doesn't mean that the Word of God is not filled with love and compassion. Sometimes, maybe to do what's right, it may sometimes mean going against the institution where they've gone wrong and follow God in our hearts. Probably the first time I've gotten really theological on this channel. Ultimately, we do not do what is right because we're told to. Ultimately, we must do the right thing because it is right. Because we've considered the other options and decided to do the right thing. And until next time, may the right thing be getting a good amount of training in, making sure you're eating right, get some sleep, get hydrated, and until next time, peace be with you.